Welcome back, wonderfully patient viewers, to the show where we won't answer your burning questions like, if silence is violence, why was anyone surprised that things were all quiet on the Western Front? Welcome to Cartoon Gateway, the show where I talk about the average trials and tribulations of a cartoon fan. I'm your host, David Hollander. It's my first episode back after a bit of a break. In fact, actually, I'm taking a break from the prompter to talk about this because this needs to be said. I have been gone so long that fellow SCM program, Real Film Talk, the day I came in to film this, did an episode on X-Men 97, a cartoon, what I am supposed to talk about. I'm not bitter. Job security, what's that? But anyway, that aside, to celebrate my inglorious return, I thought I'd talk about something interesting. You know, like Henry VIII. But I'm no history teacher, I'm a cartoon failure. I do my best to make this a gateway series, for people who might not already enjoy cartoons or discourse thereof. And it occurred to me, while I was on this break between batches of episodes, that there is an important aspect of cartoons that I never quite explained fully, or at least something that I should have explained earlier. If you've watched previous episodes of this show, you might have heard me throwing around the term serialized, and like a good little boy, I put that definition up on screen. One time and never again. I guess I neglected to realize that some people might not watch every episode of this show, or some viewers might even miss the explanation of that term. What if I get lazy, use the term episodic, and don't define it? Or worse, what if I did define it and put the definition on screen, but all I put there is the opposite of serialized and just left it at that? People would be more confused in that time France was overthrown like 6 times back to back by itself. You like these history jokes I'm trying, or the new camera setup? I'm trying to sprinkle a little more of history jokes in. Since I'm a history buff, I can like things besides cartoons. Homeostasis, for one, I quite enjoy that. So in case you weren't here last time I explained what serialization is, here's the definition as used in TV. When the narrative of a TV show carries over from episode to episode, requiring episodes to be watched in order to completely comprehend the story. You've definitely seen shows like this in your lifetime, not just your cartoons, but live action as well. Probably the show that I can best use as an example is Lost. That show doesn't make sense if you watch it out of order, you know, that kind of thing. And not to get distracted too soon, but I've got a film professor who'd go crazy if I didn't talk about this. Yeah, you know, you can cut this out of the episode if it eats up too much time, but like, you know how at the time it was airing, people who stopped watching Lost said it was because the writers clearly had no idea where the show was going anymore? It's actually the opposite. The writers went into the show without a plan, and then when fans complained about inconsistencies, then they got themselves a plan. And the point where they implemented that plan lines up just about exactly with when people said the show fell off. I know that's far from relevant. One of my old professors just think that's funny, and so do I. But going back on topic, you've probably known what serialization is for a long time, just not that it's a concept with a name. And just to cover my bases, let's talk about the opposite of a serial show, the episodic show. Episodic means that a TV show doesn't really have a strict order. These kinds of shows, you can watch basically any episode in any order. And it won't be a real problem. Each one is self-contained. Fairly Odd Parents, for example. Broadly speaking, you don't need the deep lore, nor do you need required viewing to understand most episodes. So with that out of the way, I figured that for my first episode back after a long time, I should go into the ins and outs of serialized cartoons versus episodic cartoons. It could be interesting to see how different shows handle different approaches to storytelling. Like with my episode on reboots and revivals, I hope this one could also act as a primitive writer's guide. I told you I have other interests besides cartoons. Writing counts as a separate interest. Even if it's writing cartoons, I'm multidimensional, I swear! To start, let's talk about probably the go-to example of a serialized cartoon, Avatar: The Last Airbender. And here, I forsake my right to talk about cartoons. I've never actually seen this show all the way through. Relax. I intend to watch it. You can extinguish the pyre. And while you're at it, put down the leeches, I know you're holding them. Here we have an intense action show where every episode carries into the next. If you watch this show out of order, the experience must be like slowly developing Alzheimer's. Reality breaks around you, the faces of your loved ones slowly fade from your memory, and you're left with the faint sensation that M. Night Shyamalan messed something up. Each season of the show is called a book, and each episode a chapter. Usually I find that kind of thing pretentious, but here it makes sense. You're ordering things so kids watching this before streaming becomes big and dooms us all can immediately tell if they've missed an episode. The show is themed around the 4 classical elements: earth, water, fire, and air. So naturally the show only had 3 seasons with books for Water, Earth, and Fire. I guess air is in the title, but this will hurt my head till the day I die. Oh yeah, streaming's been weird with how serialization is handled. On the one hand, if a show is exclusive to streaming, it's pretty obvious what order episodes have to be in. They were posted in that order. But if not, you get situations like Disney Plus. Some of my favorite shows on that platform are completely out of order because some poor intern just copied and pasted the episodes into the platform by air date order, when believe it or not, sometimes a show might not even air in order. That's mostly a 2000s thing, but not uncommon today. Even 2017's DuckTales was a little out of order when it aired. X-Men Evolution is another good example, particularly in its later seasons. Episodes were aired out of order. You'd be better off watching in production order, but since they're in Disney Plus by air date order, I hope you have a laptop or a notepad handy to keep track of stuff. Fantastic Four, World's Greatest Heroes, has probably gotten the worst of it since the show had a really weird production history. It bounced around a ton of networks and was woefully out of order by air date, even though it was completely in order in the DVD release, so surely Disney Plus could have just used DVD order, but right. But instead, recurring villain Mole Man is introduced in episode 2, which is the 25th episode in Disney Plus. It's even more annoying when there's only one episode that's in the wrong place, and I'm convinced Disney Plus does that kind of thing on purpose in some instances. Why else was a single episode of Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes out of order? Why was that in the wrong spot when it didn't air out of order? Okay, you know what? They fixed that, so I digress. Disney Plus, you can have this for now. It's also easy to, for lack of a better term, mess up while watching an older show on streaming, even if it's aired in order, just because some shows might get you in the habit of watching out of order or vice versa. For instance, the first time I watched Transformers Beast Wars as a kid on Netflix. When I was that young, I hadn't seen a lot of shows that needed to be watched in order, and Beast Wars felt like a fever dream to me because of it, all because I was an idiot and watched chunks of the show out of order, only watching what looked like important episodes. It's even worse when something happens in an episode that is otherwise inconsequential, so you have to watch it even if you normally skip it. The Beast Wars episode that introduces Black Arachnia, one of the most important characters in the show, I hasten to add, that episode isn't even about her introduction, nor is she even mentioned in the episode's logline. So I completely skipped it by mistake, left to wonder why Tarantula suddenly had a gross-looking sister. That might be a bit of a weird joke, but no, I'm keeping that in. Sometimes shows can benefit from serialization, and sometimes they can suffer. One of the more interesting cases being Steven Universe. Rather infamously, the first dozen or so episodes were aired out of order, and that was fine because this was the first season. The show was almost entirely episodic at that point. So nothing was really lost. The downside of this is when the show did get super serialized. As far as I'm aware, Cartoon Network was at least good about airing things in order from then on, but the consequence of that was breaks between episodes got painfully long. Like half a year to a year and a half long. It's agony to sit through, but that's just what happens to a show when episodes are produced several at a time while episode chronology is super strict. You'll notice, as I pointed out before, that in the 2010s, networks really didn't like airing serialized cartoons in general. If you were making a cartoon in the 2010s and you wanted it to be serialized, you basically had to trick the network into picking up your show by having it start as episodic. Rise of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles did that, and I congratulate them for being made at all. This was an age where serialized shows on networks were dying, and most reboots failed on arrival. This show started out all disconnected and episodic, but close to the end of its first season had a massive continuous story, and that story continued into its second season. But you all know why Rise of the TMNT didn't pan out super well despite being a good show, and if you don't know, let me tell you why. Let me tell you a tall tale. Let me elaborate for you. I used to be a cashier, and at the store I worked, we stocked up on cheese sticks, branded with Nickelodeon characters, and among those were Rise of the TMNT cheese sticks. As a cashier, I rang those specific cheese sticks up maybe once or twice. I still rang up those cheese sticks more times than I saw Nickelodeon air the show. It did not get proper treatment, basically not airing. I'd call it sabotage if I had the wherewithal or vitriol or the proof. But I don't have any of those things, so I'll call it inconvenient. You win this time, Nickelodeon. In fact, before I wrap on serialized shows, I want to quickly shout out both Amphibia and The Owl House for being modern examples of serialized cartoons. I'd love to talk about them in depth. Shame I've never watched either of them. Don't hate me, guys, both of these are from way after my time, and I'm not about to go in depth about a show I've never seen, much less two. I know what I am and am not qualified to talk about, and these shows definitely both fall into the not category. But let's divert from just serialized shows for a bit, because that's only half the discussion. There's also episodic shows, which, as I described before, have no fixed order you have to watch them in. Shows like this are usually comedies or shows where plot doesn't really matter. Both could describe The Simpsons, in fact. There's one major show that baffles me that I haven't talked about here before, so I'll bring it up now.
Who lives in a pineapple under the sea?
I got someone laughing behind the camera. SpongeBob, that show every cartoon reviewer talks about at least once. I mean, if I wanted to be really contrarian, I could just talk about, I don't know, Coconut Fred or something. But I'm a cartoon guy. This was as inevitable as dementia. There's no escape. So let's get into it. We all know SpongeBob's deal, absorbent, yellow, and porous is he. If you ask someone what the plot of SpongeBob is, I'm pretty sure they're legally required to tell you to suck an egg. There's no real narrative to the show. Plenty of episodes have narratives, but nothing that can't be confined to a single episode. Do you need to watch anything in order? No, but actually, yes. And here we get into the weird thing about episodic shows. Sometimes they make follow-up episodes. For instance, there's the classic SpongeBob episode, Bubble Buddy, where SpongeBob makes a friend out of bubbles. A buddy, if you will. Don't make me explain more, please. Then, several seasons later, the episode got a sequel. Two, in fact. So you could probably call that serialization, but it's pretty weak in comparison to actual serialized programming. But I do still see the argument. You need context from a previous episode to understand the new ones. That's just serialization, so does it count? I guess, but on a small scale. Especially because the follow-up episodes in question are several seasons apart. Regular Show and Fairly Odd Parents did this too. If they directly followed up an episode, they do so at least one season apart. On the topic of both of those shows, there's also instances where episodic shows can introduce a new main character, like Poof in Fairly Odd Parents, or Thomas in Regular Show. Serialized shows do this too, like with Smokescreen in Transformers Prime, or pretty much the entire cast in each subsequent season of Young Justice. In cases of episodic shows specifically doing this, it's still technically a case of you need prior context to understand stuff, but not nearly that bad. Like with Poof, you don't need much background to understand where he came from. Or sometimes you get a case like Thomas, where he's a temporary addition to the cast. Not much to talk about here, but I thought I'd point it out. And aside from that, yeah, you don't need much more when it comes to talking about episodic shows, unless someone is just obsessed and wants me to talk about Uncle Grandpa for some reason. If that's you, congratulations, you're determined. Though before we end off, I want to talk about some more gray area stuff between serialized and episodic shows. To start with, how about the 1984 Transformers cartoon? Yeah, it's absolutely episodic. Sure, they introduce new characters in the second season, but most of the time, there's no explanation for where they even came from anyway, so you barely need context. But then, the 1986 movie happened, in which Hasbro did a messy and brutally killed off several prominent characters, including Optimus Prime, Starscream, and others, only to replace them with a new cast of characters. Heroes and villains, which is where the third season picks up. So if you didn't watch this movie, you'd have absolutely no idea what happened to the older characters, or where the new ones came from. It's a pretty massive status quo change, so does that count as serialization if it's not in the show itself, but the tie-in movie? There's also plenty of instances, especially from the 2010s, of shows starting off as episodic and becoming serialized as they went on. I mentioned Steven Universe and Rise of the TMNT already, but another big one was Regular Show. If you didn't know, they actually got a pretty involved plot in their 7th season, taking place mostly in the background before becoming prominent later on. Then we get a cliffhanger ending, which transitions into the final season, Regular Show in Space! You have to say it like Pigs in Space, which was almost completely serialized. Yeah, cheesy as it is, I think it was the right call to give this season a different name because of the massive status quo shift between seasons. And this change didn't start in season 7. It goes all the way back to the 4th season when the show started getting more involved in Mordecai's relationship drama. I'll talk more about that in a future episode. But I want to point out that this drama, intrusive as it was, did serve a vital purpose, training the viewer to watch the show in order at a time when they normally didn't do that, so they'd be prepared for when the show became fully serialized. Just saying, this wasn't an overnight thing. Then there's probably the best transition of an episodic show becoming serialized: Adventure Time. Let's talk positively about this show for once, because I realize I've been a bit too negative on it in the past. The show started almost completely episodic, save for the occasional follow-up episode. But as the show went on, it turned out there was legitimate lore going on. They tried some more ambitious storytelling. They started small, 2-part episodes and the like, but then they moved to outright serialization, and they did so in small bursts, before they moved on to their most ambitious take on it, the miniseries. Adventure Time had 3 miniseries in the course of its 10-season run, starting with Stakes in Season 7, which told a largely continuous story from episode to episode. With the unique intro and title sequence, you could tell this was something different from the norm. Then they did Islands in Season 8, going right into Season 9's premiere miniseries, Elements. Obviously, the show engaged in serialized storytelling outside of these miniseries, but the miniseries did feature the biggest stories in status quo shifts, save for probably the final season, which by that point the change was already terminal. Remember how I said regular shows slowly trained its viewers to watch the show in order at a time when they weren't doing that? Well, Adventure Time did the same, though much more slowly and with much more ambition. Though I'll admit, it probably didn't help Adventure Time that its own lore got so complicated. Like, you can probably watch regular show in space. Regular show in space! You can probably watch that slightly out of order, only slightly, mind you, and things could still make sense if you kept the major beats of the season in the same order. Conversely, Adventure Time got so in-depth that it was borderline incomprehensible at times. If you missed an episode, there is a good chance you are missing something important. I still love Adventure Time, but I absolutely do not fault the people who stopped watching it at all. It was laborious, especially because Cartoon Network was airing it less and less towards the end. That's about all I had to say. If you were expecting this to be some kind of which is better, serial or episodic, sorry you wasted your time. Because really neither is better. You judge a show based on what it's trying to do. Sometimes that's to engage an audience for a multi-part story. Sometimes that's just to have a good laugh. Hope this was informative, and it's good to be back. This has been Cartoon Gateway, and I am most definitely not a parasite that has taken the form of your host, David Hollander. Tune in next time, where we won't answer your burning questions like, should the next step after self-care be others' harm?
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.